Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris. Today we're going over the bell curve, Chapter 8, entitled Family Matters. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about IQ as it relates to really three specific things that that lives underneath this umbrella of family. So we're going to talk about marriage. We're going to talk about divorce, and we're going to talk about illegitimacy or births out of wedlock. Again, this goes on with the theme of part 2 of the bell curve, dealing with some social issues in America at the time of this writing. But again, as we've said throughout our deep dive in the bell curve, think about when this book was written and see how much of it can apply today. And you'd probably see that most, if not all, of these things discussed in this book apply today just as much as they did in 1994 or, the late 1980s, whenever the survey data from the NLSY was conducted. Let's get things started here with this quote from page 168. Large proportions of young people are staying single. Half the marriages end in divorce, and out-of-wedlock births are soaring. This is kind of like a little summary of what's discussed in this chapter, right? And they're going to kind of compare, like the first thing we're going to talk about is marriage and kind of go through the trends over time, at least as far as marriage is concerned, like what it used to be and what it is at the time of this writing. But this is kind of a good summary of the findings of the things that they are going to come to conclude, not necessarily conclude, but this is what their findings are telling them, right? So let's continue forward. We're first, like I said, talking about marriage. And what has the marriage rate been over the course of U.S. history? So this kind of surprised me because I always just kind of assumed that marriage rates were always pretty high up until, relatively recent times, like my lifetime, 90s, 2000s. Today, I figured they'd be plummeting, especially today. But as you can see from the graph, it tells a different story. It's gone up, it's gone down. Mainly based on some pretty traumatic events in our history. The Great Depression, as you can see there, marriage rates plummeted. Then leading up until World War II, they started increasing, but not without some dips in there as well. Huge increase post-World War II. Baby boom generation is being brought into life. And then a staggering decline and kind of muddles around a little bit up until 1973. Marriage rates per 1,000 women have been dropping since 1973, the authors purport, or that's what the data shows. And it's pretty much been in a decline ever since then, leading up to the publishing of the book. And the authors say still over 90% of Americans of both sexes have married by the time they reach their 40s. So seemingly marriage is still like something that most people do, is what they're saying here. They then want to take a look at marriage and IQ. So if you are really smart, does that increase your chances of getting married? If you're in the lower cognitive classes, does it decrease your chances of getting married? The authors talk about here, they introduced this gentleman, Robert Rutherford, who did some work in this area, and he said that, it used to be like earlier America, successful and the wealthy married at younger ages compared to the poor. But in today's world, this is kind of completely flipped around, where the poor are getting married at younger ages, whereas those more successful, more higher IQ, they're postponing marriage until later in their lives. And they talk about this is very pronounced, and you kind of see this today a little bit with the successful woman. Smart professional woman is oftentimes delaying childbirth to focus on their careers. And I've kind of seen this from personal experience. Way different than like when my parents got married and like my mom was super, super young, but also from, an Eastern European background, different traditions and values. And, this isn't a judgment call. This is just comparing the two. I'm not saying it's like right or wrong or anything like that. It's just, that just kind of is what it is. Let's continue on. We'll get to the first chart here from NLSY data on page 171. So comparing whites and marriage, which whites are getting married and when. And you can see there, again, comparing the cognitive classes, the percentage who had ever been married before age 30. And you can see the percentages there kind of relatively close, 67% of the very bright, 72% of the bright cognitive class had been married before age 30. For the very dull, it's 72%. But take a look at the average age at first marriage here. And the decline as you go down the cognitive classes. So lower on the cognitive class, you're getting married earlier. Again, kind of a flip-flop from what Robert Rutherford had found that the authors had mentioned. So this has implications for starting a family, raising children. Look at the delay there of 4 years. I mean, maybe 4 years, it doesn't sound like a lot, but definitely you are a different person at 21 than you are at 25, right? And that's not for everybody, but you definitely are more, I would say in general, probably more mature, farther in your career, have some life experience, maybe own some property, live in a house, you have some equity to your name, et cetera, et cetera. So this was findings from the I believe this was, NLSY, the NLSY, yep. Let's continue on. What about the role of socioeconomic background? So the authors say percentage of whites who had been married by 30 declines at both extremes. Okay, so what do they mean by that? They mean that at the extremes of those classes, so classes 1 through 5, again, high to low, high IQ, low to IQ, so high SES to low SES, percentage of whites who had been married by 30 declines at both extremes. Okay. So what does that really say? Socioeconomic status has a much larger suppressive role on marriage. Okay, very interesting. IQ has an insignificant downward probability, and the authors note that you have to be cautious on these results. So specifically, they say here on 171, IQ, age, socioeconomic status as predictors of marriage. IQ has no significant and independent role. We kind of saw that, right, from the previous chart. Like all those percentages for IQ, relatively close. Now, socioeconomic status has a much larger suppressive role on marriage. The richer and better educated your parents, the less likely you are to marry, according to these results. So that's where the authors say, okay, you kind of got to be a little cautious when you're talking about that, right? The richer, better educated your parents are, the less likely you're to be married. Like that, I was a little confused on that because I wouldn't have guessed that would have been the case. I would have guessed if you come from a good SES background that you're more likely to get married. But let's continue on. So now they're going to do education now. We get to our next graph here. Graph is entitled High IQ Raises the Probability of Marriage for the White High School Sample, while Socioeconomic Background lowers it. Very interesting for the high school sample. For the college sample, you can see there, barely any difference. Barely any difference. So what this kind of says is the role of IQ for the high school sample more pronounced. The role of SES for the high school sample more pronounced. And if you're in college, it's not really a factor either way. Those who are in college are going to get married. Right? It's just not as much of a factor in that. So you can see here the classic bell curve line graphs that we see. IQ is the black line, parental SES is the gray line for the high school sample. And as you can see, as you go from a low to a high IQ, the chances of the probability of marriage by age 30 increases to almost like 90%. It's like a 30% swing. Parental SES, as you go from very low to very high, actually decreases a little bit. The difference, not by much, probably like a couple percentage points. Not by much, but very high. Why do you think that this could be? Possibly maybe your parents coming from that high socioeconomic background, maybe they get a little choosy for you. Maybe you start to think that your life is pretty comfortable. You necessarily don't have to marry. I don't know. I think it has a lot to do with maybe the parental pressure from being from a high socioeconomic background that's affecting this. But then again, the authors say you got to kind of be a little bit cautious in this regards. Let's continue on. We're going to talk about divorce next. There we go. The divorce revolution. So a little history here in the divorce rates. Divorce rate used to be pretty low. Look at that trend line from 1920 to 1940. Slightly increasing a little bit, but then that huge jump in the mid-1960s to 79. Big jump here. Said that the divorce rate hit its peak at the end of the 1970s. A marriage had more than a 55% chance of ending in divorce. Wow. And then on the y-axis there, you see that divorces, they're measuring this on divorces per 1,000 women. That's not percentage on the y-axis. Years, of course, on the x-axis. Looks like it kind of headed down a little bit from that 1979 peak going to the publishing of this book. But what does this say about divorce and IQ? Well, let's take a look at the NLSY data there. Which whites get divorced and when? Comparing the cognitive classes again. Percentage divorced in the first 5 years of marriage. Look at that. It seems like a pretty significant increase. Going from the high cognitive class, very bright, to very dull. You're going from 9% chance, or 9% of those getting divorced in the first 5 years of marriage to 21%. Wow. Why is this? Well, the authors kind of, give some thoughts on this, that, well, brighter people less often marry on a whim, so they actually think about their decisions and contemplate if this person is truly the right person for them. They probably maybe have some sort of values that they ensure that they view divorce as something that's like a negative thing, if that coming from the place where they live, where they come from, like the family they grew up in, they view divorce as very negative, so that might affect it. They're less likely to act on just an impulse, like, yeah, let's just get married, and then turns out that it was actually not a very good decision. They really didn't factor in a lot of other things. But also in the case of problems that arise in the marriage, they're more likely to work things out, think about things logically, hear the other person out, and get through whatever problems they are facing. Let's continue. What about the role of socioeconomic background? Another line graph here. Black line as IQ goes from low to high. Gray line as parental SES goes from low to high. And again, in each scenario there, they're holding the other variable constant or at its mean value. So it seems like IQ has a protective effort of protecting against divorce. And again, very high socioeconomic status, divorce increases. The chances of divorce increase in the first 5-year marriage. That is very staggering, and I would not have guessed that at all. So it seems like, again, IQ, as it goes from low to high, you've got a almost 20 percentage point decrease in your chances of getting divorced, whereas for parental SES, it's close. What would that be? Maybe like a 10% difference, but going the other way, increasing your chances. Very, very interesting. Well, what about education again? So higher levels of education associated with lower levels of divorce. So it seems like for a high school sample, similar to what we saw for the graph for marriage, high school sample, you see these stark differences. You know, you see that IQ has a tremendous effect on the high school sample, but for the college sample, not a big difference. Whether you are talking about the higher ends of IQ for that sample to the lower ends of IQ. People are staying or getting married either way. So here we have divorce rate for a bachelor's degree was less than half the high school sample. So the divorce rate for a bachelor's degree, 7% compared to 19% for the high school sample. Holding other things constant, though, divorce rate for high school graduates was lower in the first 5 years compared to college graduates. Think about that for a second. Holding other things constant, though, divorce rate for high school graduates was lower in the first 5 years compared to college graduates. So they're holding things like IQ constant, I'm assuming, holding socioeconomic status constant here. IQ made much more of a difference with the college sample, 28% to 9%. Going from an IQ of 100 to 130. So interesting here. So this is for divorce, right? So IQ made more of a difference with the college sample. So this is reverse of the getting married thing, actually. So what was I saying at the start of this slide? I think I basically just contradicted myself on this slide. But yes, okay. The slide's on marriage. Comparing college and high school, the IQ and the SES, more of a pronounced effect for the high school sample in just getting chances of getting married by age 30. For divorce, it's the opposite. IQ made much more of a difference in the college sample than the high school sample. Very interesting. And I wonder why. I wonder why that is. Be something to look at. How about this? The authors ask this question. Do broken families beget broken families? What do they mean by that? So children of divorced parents have a greater chance of being divorced themselves, although the effects are not as strong as IQ, like we kind of saw from that previous graph. So they give some little stats here. Child who at age 14 had been living with both parents, the chances of becoming divorced, 20%. Child who had been living with a remarried parent, 22%. And then the child who had been living with an unremarried or never married mother, 25%. So there is an increase. But again, is it as strong of a protective factor as IQ is, the authors kind of suggest here probably not. Probably not. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is illegitimacy, or being born out of wedlock, or what's like a formal definition here? Out of births to a single woman. Okay, so single woman not in the institution of marriage, I think, is like a traditional definition here. The authors reference Dr. Bronus Malinowski in this, who has this decided that this amounted to a universal sociological law and called it the principle of illegitimacy, principle of legitimacy. I said that right. No matter what the culture might be, there runs the rule that the father is indispensable for the full sociological status of the child as well as of the mother, that the group consisting of a woman and her offspring is sociologically incomplete and illegitimate. This is where that word illegitimacy comes out. They're going to use this term instead of the other term, out of wedlock births, or child out of wedlock. So the illegitimacy revolution, we got the marriage, it's funny, we had the marriage graph, we had the divorce graph, and now we have the illegitimacy graph. And you can see here, pretty constant. Look at those trend lines, 1920 to 1952, percentage of children born out of wedlock, pretty constant. Yeah, 53 through 63, it starts to increase a little bit. And then 1963 onward, huge explosion. By 1990, you're talking about a 30% chance of a child being born out of wedlock. And the authors talk about here that there's a compounding interest in this, in that, like, there's, how do I explain compounding interest? The dividends are reinvested, the interest compounds, so it just adds up on top of each other. Right, so you get interest on $1, 6%, let's say $6. Now you're getting 6% of that $6, and it just compounds and it keeps adding. It's like a savings account, right? So unmarried mothers in 1960 that were between the ages of 18 and 34, 73,000. By 1980, it was 1 million. Okay, then by 1990, it was 2.9 million. Wow, look at that. It seems like it's taking less number of years to reach 1 million, right? 20 years to reach 1 million, and in 10 years it increased by 1.9 million, almost 2 million. What is going on here? And does it have anything to do with IQ? Well, look at the NLSY data here, the incidences of illegitimacy among young white women. As you go from very high to very low cognitive class, the percentage who have given birth to an illegitimate baby. Very low for the very bright class. Actually, very low for classes 1 through 3. I mean, 2, 4, and 8% there, chances. Look at that for the dull and very dull, classes 4 and 5. You're talking about a 17 and 32% chance giving birth to an illegitimate baby, respectively there. That is pretty high, 32%, almost a 1 in 3 chance. And then we have two other graphs here. So the graph on the left, let's talk about this one first. So this is the proportion of white first births that were illegitimate. So your first child that was born. And again, you see the stark difference between classes 1 and 2, and then going down classes 4 and 5. Right? Look at that class 5. Even class 4, 23% of the illegitimate births were the firstborn, or the proportion of white first births, 23% of the white of first births that were illegitimate for the dull class. I pray I didn't confuse anybody out there. For the very dull, it was 42%. Huge, huge, huge. Huge. And then let's take a look at the graph, the chart on the right. So the circumstances of the first birth among whites. Again, cognitive classes, then we have born illegitimate and born after marriage. And you can see kind of the same tale the huge discrepancy between the higher cognitive classes and the lower cognitive classes, right? You can see here the mother's, the chances of having an illegitimate child, increases as you go down the cognitive classes. And then born after marriage, conceived before marriage, conceived after marriage. And you can see the higher cognitive classes oftentimes have children within marriage. You can see those on the very, very right, conceived after marriage. So the smarter couples, they're having their children within the institution of marriage, after marriage. But for the lower cognitive classes, less of them are having it within marriage. And you can see more of them are having it conceived before marriage there. Not by much. Like that conceived before marriage. Oh, so conceived before marriage. Okay. Born after marriage. Gotcha. Okay. I see what there's. So you conceived them. So what that's saying is you had sex before marriage and then you got married and then the baby was born, right? But in the other scenario, you get married, you have sex, and then it's born. It's still born after marriage. I see what they're saying there. Okay. So what about the role of socioeconomic background? Well, IQ has a large effect on white illegitimate births independent of mother's socioeconomic background. And look at this graph. As IQ goes from low to high, you're talking about a 20% swing here in the probability of an illegitimate first birth. So for those who are very, very smart, the chances are fairly low that you're going to have an illegitimate first birth rather than if your IQ is pretty low. The chances seemingly skyrocket. And for SES, again, you're seeing a difference here comparing very high to very low SES, but the difference, IQ has more of a factor in there, more of a swing. But SES does seemingly still make a slight difference, So the role of education. Let me go to this page. We're probably talking on page 184. Yep, 184. Never married women with a bachelor's degree who decided to have a baby from 1982 to 1992. Okay, increase of 3%. Now, how about the same period but for women with less than a high school education? They had an increase of 13%. Okay, so more pronounced in the high school sample. A woman who was never married, has a bachelor's degree, more than likely is not having an illegitimate child. But a woman with a bachelor's degree, 99% of the babies were born within a marriage. Okay, so virtually no independent role for IQ in the college sample is what the authors are saying here. Most of the women are having babies within marriage. But for a high school graduate, IQ has more of a factor. And you can see that here. High school graduate, IQ of 70, 34% chance of the child being born out of wedlock. But if you were a really, really smart person, smart woman with just a high school education, you still had a pretty less than a 3% chance of an illegitimate birth, right? So IQ has a protective effect that is more pronounced in the high school sample. Next, the authors talk about the rule of broken homes. So white women of average intelligence and socioeconomic status. Odds that her first child would be born out of wedlock were 10% if living with both biological parents, 18% if she was living with a biological parent and a step-parent, 25% if she was living with her mother. So have you guys ever heard the phrase hurt people, right? The theory that like if you yourself were victims of like bullying or or a victim of assault, sexual assault, etc., that you are more likely to perpetrate that act in the future. Well, so this is kind of saying the same thing. If you come from a broken home, the chances of you also fostering a broken home for your child increase, right? Let's continue. 8% if the biological mother, but not the father, was absent by age 14. And they talk about this age. 14 was like a really important age that they discuss here. Who are still living with their at age 14 were protected. And I wonder why they use 14 rather than like 13 or like 16, something like that. It might be just due to like certain developments in biology that happen right around that age. I'm not sure. That would be interesting to look at. So, okay, so by age 14, 8% if the biological mother but not the father was absent by age 14. So the odds of you having a child born out of wedlock. So 8% if both biological parents were absent at age 14. So essentially adopted children, right? I find that really interesting. Both your parents absent, and that really doesn't make a difference compared to if you had a single parent, but that single parent was a father, as in the previous bullet point, right? 10% if both biological parents were present at age 14. Okay, now check this out. 23% if the biological father was absent by age 14. So what is this kind of saying? The role that a father has in the child's life in preventing more out of wedlock births for the future progeny. And this is kind of what the authors were talking about in compounding interest. See, the more out of wedlock births, then it's increasing the chances of even more of them for the children of those who had that child out of wedlock. And the last bullet point there, IQ has a protective factor in out of wedlock births, but socioeconomic status, very, very weak. Very weak. How about the role of poverty and welfare? Is having babies out of wedlock something that is done disproportionately not only by women who come from low SES, but women who are literally poor themselves when they reach childbearing age? Okay. How about this? Among NLSY white mothers who were below the poverty line in the year prior to giving birth, what proportion of the babies were born out of wedlock? So 44% if you were below the poverty line in the year prior to giving birth, right? But if you were above the poverty line, only 6% chance. Wow. So seemingly poverty has a role in this as well. Seemingly. But what does IQ have to do with this? IQ, look at this graph. IQ is a more powerful predictor of illegitimacy among poor white women than among white women as a whole. So not only is IQ a factor in just a regular average woman, average SES, right, not living below the poverty line, it has a role in having an illegitimate birth. But it seems here it's more pronounced for the poor white women. And you can see the huge swing here. Look at that. As IQ goes from low to high, the probability that the first child will be born out of wedlock for a white woman already below the poverty line goes from 70% to almost 10%. Wow. Don't get me wrong, for parental SES, it's still a big difference too. Still a big difference there too, but it's the opposite effect again, right? As you go towards a high parental SES, the probability increases. And I wonder why that is. But IQ has a very profound effect here, a protective factor in making sure that in keeping children from being born out of wedlock, I think is the best way to say that. So here's where we conclude, ladies and gentlemen. Children of white NLSY mothers in the top quartile of cognitive ability versus those in the bottom quartile. Okay. Percentage of households with children that consist of a married couple. 87% to 70%. All right, so this is top cognitive ability to the bottom cognitive ability. Pretty big difference, 70%, 17% difference. Percentage of households with children that have experienced divorce, 17% versus 33%. Again, pretty staggering difference. Percentage of children born out of wedlock, 5% for the top cognitive ability, 23% for the bottom quartile of cognitive ability. And by the way, probably, here's the last point. American family is under siege, but it's at the bottom of the cognitive ability that it's crumbling. So I have no doubt that even for the top cognitive ability, you're seeing divorce rates maybe increased. You're seeing, out of wedlock births maybe increased, right? You're seeing children that have experienced divorce maybe increased. Although in today's realm, I think marriage rates have been plummeting anyway, so naturally that leaves not a lot of room for just potential divorces, right? But for the lower cognitive classes, it's much more pronounced than for the higher cognitive classes. And that's where the crumbling is happening. And I wonder what the population in that bottom quartile is. How small it is, how large it is. Because if that's a big population that we're talking about, then this crumbling is going to have an effect on many, many different aspects of our society. And that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you guys so much for listening. Oh my gosh. This was a fun chapter. Thank you very much if you listened this far. We're going to have another episode out next week. I know this one was a little late in the day. I'm going to try to be on time next week. I've been pretty busy with some other projects. But if you have a question, you want to start a discussion, please leave it below. Please like and subscribe to this video. I'm almost done with this book. I've only got like about 100 pages left. And as soon as I finish it, we're going to start on something pretty fun for the next book. Thank you guys very much. This has been Chee-Tash. My name is Chris. Take care.